All right, it is now.
a little bit.
Yeah.
Sorry for that.
I can review that later if you want me to. Let me verify that that's okay. It is. Student information system records. Student information system contains a lot of student data all combined in one place. Since that's all in one place and it contains a lot of information about our students, it would contain student PII. So that's something that you would need explicit permission to share outside of our internal environment. Unpublished employee directory information. So unpublished employee directory information would be similar to that is accessible on the website, but it is not publicly visible. If it requires authentication to view, meaning you have to enter your username and password to view that, now that is considered private information. So at that point, you could arguably classify that as PII because it is not publicly accessible. Waived FERPA data. So FERPA data functions in two ways, and I'll cover unwaived in a minute, but waived FERPA data is data that would be covered by FERPA that a student has explicitly waived for disclosure. That may contain PII about them, but since they have waived it, we can share that data in limited fashion. But it should still be treated with care because it could still be used for nefarious purposes if the wrong people gain access to it. And combined contact information elements. So this goes back to what I was referring to with individual contact elements. Combined contact information elements would be, let's say you have an Excel spreadsheet and it has my name on it, it has my address on it, and it has my phone number on it, all in one row. Now you would consider that PII because with that, you can identify me. You would be able to know, I know that Ward lives here and that this is his phone number. You could then use that to trace me, to identify me, and potentially steal my identity through social engineering. So now we're going to move on restricted. Restricted is the highest risk data that we carry. Restricted is in all cases PII and should never be shared unless you have explicit permission to do so with a pre-authorized entity. So as I said before, the first, social security numbers. Social security numbers are the number one thing you can use to steal someone's identity, and they should never be shared outside of any situation that would not call for it in an official business context. Unwaived FERPA protected data. So unwaived means a student has not waived their FERPA rights to that data. That data cannot be shared outside authorized channels. Banking and payment card information, so things like bank routing numbers, bank accounts, payment card information or PCI, that cannot be shared outside any authorized channels. And student employee health information. Student employee health information would be HIPAA protected. So all of this is, that would be regulated data that cannot be shared outside our environment unless given to an explicitly authorized group. So now that we've identified PII, given examples, and kind of talked about that risk matrix, how does that tie into AI usage? So when using AI tools such as Gemini and Notebook LM, it's important to consider what data is being uploaded to them in concern to PII. As I covered, it's important to remember that combined data points can equal PII. So PII categories can and should be referenced to determine what data is safe to use in AI models and what data should never be disclosed, private instance or otherwise. And when I say private instance, I'm referring to AI tools that the university has stricken agreements with. So typically, if we buy, like we talk about Gemini and Notebook LM, we have pre-established business contact with those two tools. Because of that, those instances are private. They're not being used to train their models. So all of that data stays in a bubble that the larger language model can't see. So it's still somewhat disclosed to the AI model, but it's not disclosed to the world at large. So using this risk model, you can determine what you can and can't share. So in most cases, public data can be used. Since public data is already out there for the purposes of being viewed, you can share that with an AI. Private data should, so generally the rule is sharing less is better. So if you can share less, that's a good thing. For example, if you were trying to write a letter to someone and you had combined data elements, name, address, phone number, that you'd want to use to send to this person, you don't necessarily have to use that to form a letter through Gemini or Notebook LM. You could write a generic prompt saying, I'm trying to write a letter to a student about this subject without feeding that data in. But there are business case uses where private data may be useful inside of an AI tool for data analysis and those sorts of things. So in that case, private data can be utilized as long as it's in a CTS vetted and approved AI tool, such as Gemini and Notebook LM. If you don't know if a tool is authorized for that kind of use within our environment, contact CTS and we can let you know. We are currently at work creating a website for quick reference that will have a full matrix of what ones we've analyzed and what data you can use with them. So that will be forthcoming. And restricted data may not be used with AI tools in any capacity. Due to the sensitivity and high regulatory needs of that data, you cannot use restricted data in generative AI. And some best practice for AI and PII. As I just said, always use CTS approved AI tools as they have agreements in place to keep data in a private instance. And that's just best practice. Even if it's public data, always gravitate toward the ones that we've reviewed and authorized because we know exactly who makes it. We have their information on file and we know their general security practices because when we make these deals, we analyze all of their security infrastructure so that we know what they're doing to protect our data, especially in the case of private instance. Because just because it's private, we also want to know how they're protecting those private instances. As said, an AI tool has not been vetted by CTS, only utilize data classified as public until it is approved by CTS for other forms of data. So as we know, we've got a lot of academics, they explore the use of new AI tools because it's a rapidly expanding field. So if you're experimenting with an AI model that you might consider bringing for a wider purchase or wider use at the university, make sure you're only using public data until we're able to vet and verify that that's an okay model to put any more sensitive data into. If attempting to perform a function with an AI tool, try using generic prompts without PI class data to see if you get an adequate result. That goes back to the example about forming a letter. You may not necessarily need to put any PII or classified data into something to get a desired result. So give that a shot first. If it doesn't work, take a look at what type of data you're working with and then make a determination if you can proceed. So if you're trying to make something work with private data, it doesn't work that way. And you want to put that private data in if you're using something like Gemini and Notebook LM, you can do that. If it's restricted, you can't. Public, go nuts. And be wary of AI integration in products such as email services and cloud or local storage integrations. So what I mean by that is think about hooking, let's say, I'll use Gemini as an example because we're mostly Google campus. So with Gemini, you can hook that into Google Drive, you can hook that into email services, but because of how those work, they will scan everything in there and then port that over to the AI model to help with productivity. But who here knows everything that's in their email account right now? Who knows everything that's in their Google Drive right now? I don't know everything that's happening sitting in my email currently. And I mean, when you get something like PI, you should delete it, but things happen, we're human. And because of that, if you integrate Gemini into Gmail, you're feeding everything in your Gmail account into that. So if you don't know if you have private or restricted data in your email attachments floating around in your Google Drive somewhere, do not use these integrations because at that point, you may be disclosing things without knowing that you're disclosing them. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. I wanted to stop for questions. I think we may have a few of them because I know this is a big subject. I didn't, not a long session. So if there are any questions, please let me know and myself and Tyler will be happy to answer them. Questions?
Mike was asking, can we get copies of the slides?
Yeah, I can make a copy of the presentation to share out with folks. Again, I apologize that the first part of this wasn't recorded. John asked me to record it, I just fired it right. That's my mistake. If there are no questions, thank you everyone for your time.
Now, if you could record the beginning, I'll edit it in the beginning and put it out. Okay. So we'll have a big recording.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to do a good chunk of the presentation, the first quarter of it again for the purpose of having this recorded. Let's fiddle with this a little bit. I got through, I think you told me, right?
It was right about there.
Right about private is where I hit record.
Yeah, you gotta do the public part. That's where you gotta.
Yeah, the first two slides. All right. I go to the top. 1, 2, 3. Hello, my name is Ward Andrews. I work with CTS. I'm part of our security team. With me is Tyler Spalding, another member of our security team. And welcome to Personally Identifiable Information, or PII for short, best practice for AI. So let's get started. PII is defined as any information that can be used to trace or identify a single person. So what that means is information that can be used to determine who a person is and all that information about them that could be utilized to impersonate their identity. Typically, this is information that is personal, so not for business use, not for business disclosure. PII can be a single data point or multiple data points combined to form personally identifiable data. What that means is that there's some information, something like a social security number, that you could use to identify someone because that's a very powerful piece of information. Multiple data points combined would be something like a name, an address, and a telephone number in one line, since that's enough information to identify someone. PII, like other forms of data, can be broken into 3 categories based on risk level. So when we talk about risk levels, that is a 3-pronged risk system that was devised by New York State. It's also used by SUNY to kind of categorize risk and how data should be shared. So there are 3 points to that, which is restricted, private, and public. CTS is currently working on a larger adoption of this risk model for our data classification, which will be forthcoming. So the first is restricted data. Restricted data is highly regulated data. So restricted data is something where there's a lot of federal or state regulation surrounding it. Its loss or accidental disclosure could cause severe financial, reputational, and legal harm to the university, and always requires a breach notification to the feds or the state level. With restricted data, so back to the SSN, that's something like a social security number. You can only share that data with explicitly approved entities when required for business use. So this isn't something that you can just share willy-nilly with folks. This has to be something that's been pre-vetted, and you have to be pre-approved to share that information. The second is private. So private data is not as protected as restricted data, but think of it as institutional data. The example I like to use is unpublished research data. So with unpublished research data, that's not necessarily regulated. It could be dependent on the contract the research is being done under, but so that goes back to the whole, it may or may not be subject to regulations. But because it's internal data, you can share that in some cases, but you can only share that with internal approval. And then there's public data. Public data is publicly accessible data that is okay to share in most cases. So that's just data that's out there already that's easily viewable. So think if you go to the website and you look at my staff page, Ward Andrews staff page for CTS, that's okay to use and share because it's been put out there intentionally. The loss of that data would cause no loss in the university because we want you to view it. And here we have a table covering data categories and how they relate to PII. So we'll start with public. Public is low risk data that is not PII. So individual first and last names. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but individual means that it's a first and last name isolated by itself. So if you have my name, Ward Andrews, you can't really do much with that. You have my name, but there's probably other Ward Andrews out there in the world. That's not just me. So with that data, you can't use that to steal my identity or really get anywhere with social engineering. Published employee directory information. Public employee directory information would be things like our staff pages. So as I said prior, if you looked at my staff page, you would have information about me, but it's information that I want you to know about me. Because that's used for business phone. You know, it's my office phone number. It might be what building I'm in, what my job title is. That stuff's out there because you might need, you know, if you have a security problem, you might have to contact me. So you go on the website and look me up. So that can be shared. Individual phone numbers, so an isolated phone number. So since the phone number is isolated, at that point, all you really have is a phone number. You don't know who it belongs to. You don't know the address of that person. If you were to call that phone number, they could just hang up and you never know who it is. And individual addresses. So much like the phone numbers and names, an individual address doesn't really tell you much about that person. You know that it's a building and you know where that building is, but you don't know who's in it, if it's a business, if it's a private residence, who resides in it, what's done in it. So because of that, you can really share that because that is public information. I think this is where we cut off.
Okay. And we stop the recording.
Yep.
All set?
Yep.
How do I end this? Just click end in the bottom right corner.
The right at the top.
I see it now.
First. Yeah.
Here you go.